So thank you, Richard. Yes, so I think you've got a fair idea of where we see eye to eye. And I'm going to start my part of this debate explaining where we don't see eye to eye by answering this question up here. Now, of course, I've established at the beginning that the you here is not the you in the audience, or at least not as represented by the subset of you who were here for the debate I had with Colin Blakemore, and that's very heartening. But I'm sure you're all aware, especially after what Richard and I have just told you, that the view that it would be quite a good thing to put lots and lots of resources into addressing the ill health of old age by treating aging is not universally held. And a lot of people think that that's a rather bad thing to do. So I'm going to talk about why. But first of all, I'm going to start by giving you, in perhaps even starker terms than Richard just did, a feel for exactly how important this problem is. So this is actually a quote taken from Colin Blakemore's prepared remarks at the debate that I had with him here last year. He takes the view that the mission to do anything serious about aging is unrealistic, but in particular that it's a distraction from the task of preventing and curing the diseases of old age. Now, this is pretty remarkable, because aging is the cause of the diseases of old age, as you've just heard. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And, you know, this is a biologist, right? He's an important guy. He's a biologist. He ought to know this. Furthermore, the fact that he is able, in his mind, to divorce aging from the diseases of old age allows him to take the view that you've heard Pascal Harter expounding earlier on, that it's actually a bad idea to do this. He actually states this in even starker terms than we've heard so far today. He says the consequences of this, quote, miracle would be a disaster for humanity and for the planet. Now, here's my point. Colin Blakemore used to run the Medical Research Council. The Medical Research Council is the body that orchestrates the funding of medical research in this country, most of it. So, in other words, Colin Blakemore is far more influential than any biologist studying aging on the entire planet. And he thinks this sort of thing. He's the sort of person that politicians listen to much more than they currently listen to either myself or Richard. This is the result. And I'm talking here about the US because I just happen to know the numbers better in the US. The National Institutes of Health, which is the US equivalent of the Medical Research Council, has a budget in the region of $30 billion a year. Only $1 billion of that goes to the National Institute on Aging. Only about 1/6 of that $1 billion goes to study of the biology of aging, biogerontology. It's an amazingly small amount. And actually, if one looks at how much of that money is spent on remotely translational work, in other words, work focused on doing something about aging, then it's a tiny proportion of that. So we must ask, why is this? What's going on? What the fuck is what we need to find out here. It could be short-termism. It could be, in other words, people in power, people with deep pockets, people who make policy are interested in demonstrating results really quickly. And we see certainly that there's a tendency for research grants to be shorter than they used to be. You know, there is short-termism in the psychology of funding these days, that's for sure. A big one, though, is people who make these decisions actually listen to people like Colin Blakemore. And they are very scared that we might actually get somewhere with this. And I'll say some more about that on the next slide. Another thing, however, which I think is really important and which didn't entirely come out in what Richard just said, is that there is a great deal of pessimism that this work will ever pay off. If the Rand Corporation says that you'll get a life year, a quality-adjusted life year or whatever, for only $8,000 by postponing aging, but it'll cost you 10 times that if you postpone Alzheimer's disease, that only motivates postponing aging rather than Alzheimer's if you think that the money spent on developing those drugs has an equivalent chance of success. If you think there's actually only a 1% chance of the money actually delivering such a drug for aging compared to the chance of delivering one for Alzheimer's, then the arithmetic goes the other way. And therefore, if one is really, really pessimistic, in other words, if one doesn't listen to either Richard or myself with regard to the feasibility of this, then one is going to make a calculation that says, let's not put any money into studying aging. This brings me to what I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time on. I feel that the biogerontology top brass, as I'm going to call them, the mainstream in gerontology, have tended to be guilty of a number of really bad errors in terms of how they have communicated both the science and the desirability of doing something about aging. So I'm going to talk about these three things here, and I have no idea why they ended up being 1, 1, and 2, but that's life. I'm going to talk about the rhetoric that mainstream biogerontology grandees tend to use, and I'm going to look specifically at a couple of things that they tend to do, essentially downplaying the link between aging and disease, and also talking about talking unjustifiably about the link between healthy lifespan and total lifespan. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what I would say, oversimplistic view that many gerontologists publicly take, and perhaps privately take as well, with regard to the translatability of laboratory success to the clinic. And then I'm going to talk about the over-pessimism that the mainstream in gerontology often have with regard to ideas that were not invented here. In other words, that have come along from other areas of biomedical research and have only recently become possibly relevant to intervening in aging. So, first of all, the rhetoric. This is a quote from a paper that was published a few years ago in the journal that I happen to edit, and it is a quote from the director of the National Institute on Aging's Biology of Aging program. That's the part that actually has this roughly $150 million budget that's less than 1% of the NIH budget. He's not the head of the program now, but he was. He's a very visionary guy, Huber Warner, and he said, the director of the NIA, in other words, Huber's boss, Richard Hodis, does not look forward to having congressmen ask him during testimony sessions about whether our goal is to extend the human lifespan. Okay, every director of any NIH institute has to do this every year. They have to stand up in front of Congress and basically justify their existence. And this is the thing. There's a fixation on the lifespan aspect of this. And the reason there's that fixation is because of people like Colin Blakemore. That's what you have to remember. So, what's this all about? What it's all about is people have not been dissuaded. People have not been told, listen, dummy, it's about health. Any lifespan effects might be good, might be bad, but they're a side effect. It's all about health. Instead, what's actually happened is that most gerontologists have publicly tended to emphasize something called compression of morbidity, which was a term first brought in by a guy named Jim Fries more than 30 years ago now. Now, Jim Fries is a great guy, but he's not a gerontologist. He's a geriatrician. And therefore, he just believed what he was told by gerontologists in terms of the ability to extend lifespan. And he was told, it can't be done. Lifespan is fixed. See there, fixed? This is from the abstract of this famous paper that he wrote, introducing the term compression of morbidity. So he said, well, okay, lifespan's fixed, but hang on, healthy lifespan surely isn't fixed. Presumably, we can postpone chronic illness by changes in lifestyle. Therefore, we will get compression of morbidity. We will shorten the period at the end of life where you're not very well. Okay? No, that's a perfectly reasonable statement. What's completely unreasonable is to jump on it as a gerontologist and to say, what we're all about is compression of morbidity. That's complete nonsense. What we're on about is extension of healthy lifespan. And if there turns out to be extension of total lifespan as well, so be it. So now I'm going to move on to what I see as over-optimism with regard to the results that have been obtained in the laboratory, some of which Richard alluded to a few minutes ago. At the top here is a statement that I have made many times over the past decade or so. I think that the approach that I favor for combating aging, which I will talk about more in a few minutes, has roughly a 50% chance, maybe better, of adding 30 years to the healthy lifespans of those who are already in middle age when the therapies are initiated, and that we can do this 25 years from now, so long as funding for the initial proof of concept work that needs to go on right now is adequate. That statement has a lot of numbers in it, and I want you to remember that, because I want you to contrast it with the statement at the bottom, which is given by a very much a leading member of the biogerontology top brass, Brian Kennedy, who runs the Buck Institute. Brian's a great guy, he's a terrific scientist, and he's probably quite a good politician too. But here's what he says that's an equivalent statement. This is a quote from their annual report, I think it was, last year. Based on what we're able to do now in the laboratory, I think it will be possible to extend health span by 15%. All right, there's one number in there, 15%, and it's a fine number. But look at the numbers that are not in that statement. He's not saying how confident he is that this is going to happen. He's not saying how soon it's going to happen. He's not saying how it's going to happen, by what technology. This is about as unfalsifiable a statement as can be made. Now, if you were someone interested in putting your own money or your taxpayers' money into the research that this guy was actually proposing to do, would this persuade you or wouldn't it? I would say it wouldn't persuade you. And lo and behold, it doesn't persuade the governments of the world, and that's why we are so underfunded, in my view. I think that's a big part of it. We are just too woolly in what we claim we might be able to achieve. Now, it's worse than that, unfortunately. This is a statement from a very famous paper written by a top gerontologist, Rich Miller, from the University of Michigan, about 10 years ago. He was writing about calorie restriction, CR up here, you see. Sorry about that. Which is a famous intervention that extends life of model organisms in the laboratory. In particular, it produces in rodents an increase in mean and maximum longevity of about 30 or 40%. What he didn't say was, that only happens if you start it when the mice are really young. If you start when the mice are in middle age, you might get 10% if you're lucky. Similarly, he goes on and talks about various mutants and so on. Thus, he says, thus, right? Now, thus is a strong word in science. You really shouldn't use it unless you can really justify what you're saying. Thus, he says, one can, with some confidence, expect that an effective anti-aging intervention, again, he doesn't say begun when, at what age, might increase the mean and maximum human lifespan by about 40%. Now, let's look at the actual things we know. And indeed, we did know 10 years ago when Rich Miller wrote that paper. We know that we can at least treble the longevity of short-lived worms that normally live about 3 or 4 weeks by starving them at the right point in their life cycle. We can get about 40%, as Rich said, in rodents. If we do it with dogs, we can only get about 10%. We now know that we can basically hardly get anything, if anything, with monkeys, though we can keep them healthy a little bit longer. If we look at humans, the best anecdotal data that we have, of course, no controlled study of calorie restriction has been done, is from Japan, where there's an island, Okinawa, in which traditionally they eat a lot less than they do in mainland Japan. They eat more or less the same dietary composition, and they have more or less the same genetics, and they do live longer. But they live less than 2 years longer. Furthermore, if we look at interventions other than diet, if we look at drugs, or if we look at genetic interventions done in any organism, then nothing in any species beats starvation done in the right way. There's one exception, which happens to be in worms, and nobody even bothered to look at this question enough to actually realize that it was important to find out whether that really was a counterexample until we came along. So actually, Sense Research Foundation is the group that's funding a test of whether this is really universally true. So it doesn't look very good for the idea that we might actually be able to develop a simple intervention that would postpone aging in humans by any significant amount that would therefore justify the increase in budget that we were hearing about earlier. And it's no surprise. Richard Doyle was wrong. Richard Doyle was saying, basically, as you heard, like there's one aging process per disease. That's certainly not true. But there's certainly not just one aging process. There are a bunch of different processes going on, not nearly so many as there are diseases that result from those processes, but there's a bunch of processes which go as slowly as they do because of the anti-aging genetic machinery that is built into our bodies, and different processes are slowed down by different genetic pathways. So we have to, we have to do a bunch of stuff to make those things not happen so fast. Therefore, a simple intervention, a single simple intervention, can only have universal age retardation function if it triggers, if it activates some genetic machinery that essentially fans out and causes a slowdown of multiple different processes. That machinery will only exist if it has been evolved for something that actually happens in the wild. And lo and behold, famines that are long enough to give 30 or 40% increase in human lifespan don't happen as often as famines that add 30 or 40% to mouse lifespan, and so on. It's just no surprise. I've pointed this out several years ago, but surprise, surprise, it hasn't actually got much traction. So this is my theory. This is my radical new theory. And it's not actually new. This is something that I took this slide out of a talk I gave back in 2004 that actually led to plenty of acrimony. Politicians might just not be as dumb as they look. They might actually not see the case that gerontologists are making. They might actually think, well, actually the evidence underlying what these people are saying doesn't seem to be there. Maybe we ought to actually stand back and look at ourselves here as gerontologists and ask ourselves whether we could actually come up with a better argument for increasing the funding of gerontology research by using real data that's better there. So now in the last few minutes, I'm going to get on to my last point, which is the, shall we say, the parochialism of gerontologists, the reluctance to entertain new approaches that had not been developed within gerontology. And I'm going to focus on regenerative medicine, which is the approach that I favor. So we've heard that aging is ultimately a bunch of a small number of processes, relatively small, that eventually cause the diseases of old age. I'm going to call those processes simply the accumulation of molecular and cellular damage. So if we talk about it that way, then we can say that the Richard Doyle approach, the geriatrics approach for combating age-related diseases, is essentially to paper over the cracks, and that's why it doesn't work, because these diseases are all happening one at a time and you're never going to catch them all. And the classical gerontology approach, shall we say, the approach that says, let's try and attack aging itself, is to come in down here and try and clean up metabolism and thereby slow down the processes that eventually cause the diseases. This is the problem. Metabolism is unbelievably complicated. Unless you rely on the things I just talked about, on triggering machinery that already exists in the body, you are not going to be able to manipulate something this complicated with a simple intervention. It's just never going to happen. And if, as I've just demonstrated, simple interventions are just not going to work nearly so well in humans, especially when started late in life, as they do in the lab, then we've got to go for more complicated interventions. So that's what we do at Sense Research Foundation. We adopt what I call the maintenance approach. It essentially involves identifying, subdividing all of the various accumulations of damage into 7 major categories, which I've listed here, and discussing, first of all, whether that is an exhaustive classification. This is essentially one of my reasons for thinking it is. Finally, then, looking at the ways in which we would actually address them. And I have propounded particular approaches to repairing each of these types of damage, or in some cases simply making them harmless. This did not go down well when I first put it forward. When I first put it forward in 2001 in Manchester, someone who is in the audience today took exception to it. I will talk about that later if you like. But a few years later, the same Rich Miller of whom I spoke earlier got 27 of his biogerontology top brass colleagues to co-author a paper in which he, shall we say, denigrated what I had to say. Unfortunately, their arguments were not terribly strong. I'm not going to have time to read all of this, but essentially what they said was demonstrated that they hadn't exactly read what I'd written, shall we say. I'm going to say a word about the most ambitious and the most challenging component of the regenerative medicine, the maintenance approach to combating aging. And it is the way of combating cancer. Cancer's a real bear. It's the hardest part of aging to fix. And a lot of people say that this approach that I've put forward is actually infeasible and just is a waste of time. But actually, it's not nearly such a departure from normal medical research and medical theory as one might expect. This approach that I call WILT is basically doing for the inhibition of telomerase, which is a thoroughly accepted, promising anti-cancer strategy, the same thing that we see elsewhere in medicine, in the case of successful medicines that have side effects, and whose side effects have to be addressed with adjunct therapies. So I feel that this particular component of the regenerative medicine approach has been somewhat over-criticized. I want to mention this paper, which is something that Richard actually mentioned a moment ago. It's a paper showing that the removal of senescent cells from the body can actually be a very powerful rejuvenating force in aging. I just want to point out that this is a component of the Sense Research Foundation approach to combating aging. It's something that has not been historically particularly pursued. It took a very long time for anyone to get around to making these mice. I don't really know why. When this paper came out, Richard actually wrote to me and said that he'd been waiting for this for 20 years, and I charitably did not write back and said, well, why didn't you do it? Because it would have been an unfair thing to say, because he wouldn't have been able to get the money, because his colleagues would also not have funded the grant. You see, this is the problem with peer review. So here's something that we do. Another example of what you might not exactly call regenerative medicine in the traditional sense, but which is part of the maintenance approach. It's molecular regenerative medicine, removing the underlying toxin that causes cardiovascular disease, the #1 killer in the Western world. We did this by putting a bacterial gene into cells and protecting them from that thing. I just want to close in my last minute or less with a word about longevity. So we've heard already from both Richard and myself that we don't work on longevity. We work on health. We're interested in keeping people healthy for a longer time. And longevity benefits that might occur as a result are a side effect of success in what Richard and I do actually work on. Now, the reason why I, in particular, get a lot of flack in relation to longevity is simply that the maintenance approach, repairing the damage that accumulates throughout life and that constitutes the aging process, is inherently, just simple math, it's sheer common sense, it's inherently a more powerful way of actually extending healthy lifespan and therefore extending total lifespan, if you can do it, than slowing aging down. So those who feel that slowing aging down is much, much easier than reversing aging by repairing damage are entitled to say, well, okay, let's just slow aging down. But if we say that at least it's unclear which of the two approaches is easier, then it makes sense actually to look at the approach of repairing damage because it will have a greater effect. I feel that the biogerontology top brass's historical knee-jerk rejection of these predictions of dramatic life extension that I've given derive, first of all, from an erroneous intuition that repair is far harder than retardation, together with this fear of sounding kooky by talking about long lifespans. So here's summing up. I feel that the mainstream in gerontology have their hearts mostly in the right place, certainly more so than they used to be. You used to see nothing like what I said about I quoted Brian Kennedy saying. Even 5 or 10 years ago, you would never see any seriously politically savvy gerontologist saying anything about extending longevity at all. However, I feel that the top brass really are still damagingly stuck in the past in terms of both their rhetoric and the science. Regenerative medicine may or may not work, we don't know, but it is completely indefensible scientifically to reject it out of hand at this point as an approach. It merits respect as a promising option as a way to postpone the ill health of old age. And what this means is that all gerontologists, whatever their favored approach to combating aging and postponing the ill health of old age, ought to be standing together in rebutting people's unfounded fears of success, people like Colin Blakemore's fears, rather than distancing themselves from each other and saying that one or another is bringing the field into disrepute. And I think that is really why Richard and I are here tonight. Thank you very much.